Welcome everybody to another episode of Free Thinkers Anonymous. This is Mike with my co-host Jeremy, and this week we're going to be talking about no CGI in films.
First off, one thing that we didn't really touch on in that first episode that I wanted to get to, and so I'm going to jump back into just briefly, is quickly touching on the false allegations of there's no CGI in that movie. You'll find that more often than not, there absolutely is CGI in that movie, and the people that are saying there's no CGI in that movie, even when they've worked on the film, have no idea what they're talking about. The other kind of three tiers of things that I wanted to bring up. First, things that have been affecting the industry for a while. So that's going to be outsourcing and globalization, streaming services, and the big six, which I'll explain what that is in just a minute. Next tier is going to be things that have affected the industry more recently, things like the pandemic and the strikes that happened last year. I also read recently that there's potentially going to be more strikes coming up. So we initially recorded this episode before I wasn't feeling well. So that's something that since then I've learned about. So we might be touching on that too. And then finally, the third tier is going to be things that are just starting to affect the industry. So that's going to be primarily AI and unionization, which also kind of ties into the strikes. AI also ties into the strikes. So we might touch on that a little bit as we're going through that, but we'll come back to it. Okay, cool. So, first thing, false allegations of no CGI in movies. There's been an odd shift from the early 2000s where people were saying, we use CGI that is better than any other CGI. It's the most advanced form of CGI that's out there. That happened primarily around 2010 with Avatar. Even films like Polar Express and Beowulf, they really pushed how much they use CGI in their films. I mean, all three of those films are between 90 and 100% fully CGI digital effects. And just to reiterate, CGI means computer generated imagery, effectively meaning that everything you see that is CGI is fully generated in a computer. There is little to nothing of photo reference or something shot on set that's actually utilized for that. The shift has been from that to like, we're doing the best CGI to we're not doing CGI. Everything's real. Everything's real. We're staying away from CGI. We might need to do a little bit of CGI here and there, but almost nothing. It's almost all real. And there's a few reasons for that, I think. First is going to be the superhero genre explosion. Initially, people were so excited about these superhero films. We're talking MCU phase one and phase two. And the end of phase two, I think, is kind of a turning point for that to a degree. Then DC movies, there's so many superhero movies that came out during that era that people got so tired of the spectacle, and where the spectacle was the story as opposed to there was a story that was enhanced by spectacle. And Avengers Age of Ultron, I think, is a good example of why that shift happened. And you'll notice after Avengers Age of Ultron, the spectacle kind of went down a little bit until you got to Avengers Endgame and Infinity War. And that's just because it had to be huge. Literally, the fate of the universe was at stake. But the superhero genre, people got tired of the spectacle. Also, the uncanny valley. That was something that really shone through when it comes to movies like Polar Express and Beowulf. It wasn't as much of a problem in Avatar, but it was still a really big problem in almost every other film that was primarily CGI trying to look real. The uncanny valley is a term that we use in the VFX industry, which means it looks so close to real, but it also doesn't look real. And because it doesn't look real, but it's so close to real, it's really, really uncomfortable to look at. It makes you feel like there's just something that you can't describe that's wrong. Most recently, I found this to be the case with anything AI. Any AI generated imagery, it just feels so alien. It feels so uncomfortable to look at, particularly with the video elements, because not only does it not quite look right, not quite look real, the perspective scales off everything else, but it also morphs from one thing to another. Secret Invasion, they used AI for the intro on that. And it feels exactly like they want viewers to feel the characters were feeling in that story for Secret Invasion, which is you don't know what's real. You don't know who's going to just suddenly be something other than what you think they are. And that weird morph, that weird shift was used as an artistic element for that intro. And I think it kind of worked. But I think you have to be wanting to use that effect of just uncomfortableness to utilize AI generated imagery more than extremely minimally. Yeah, and then the third thing is a reason for that shift from we're using the best CGI to we're not using CGI is something I kind of touched on with the superhero genre, which is just a reliance on CGI over story. It's the Fast and the Furious movies where it's like, oh, cars are jumping out of one skyscraper into another skyscraper onto the road and somehow everything's fine. Like cars are launching out of planes and off of trains and things that never made any sense. I mean, it's fun, it's cool. Transformers movies, another good example where there's no story here. And there's no characters we really care about. Maybe Optimus Prime, kind of, but it's basically the same thing over and over again there. There's so little story. There's so little character development where characters are learning something throughout the story about themselves and learning to modify their behavior because of what they learn. Where we saw that in spades in Fast and the Furious 1. You look at Brian, you look at Vin Diesel's character, like they learned and adapted and developed so much in that movie. And then you look at the new Fast and the Furious movies, and it's just spectacle. Like there's nothing else, which is why the more recent Fast and the Furious movies, they actually tried to claim everything was real or everything is mostly real or they don't rely on CGI and visual effects. Obviously, it's a lie. It's a blatant lie, complete just disregard for their viewership to think that they're dumb enough to fall for that. But they do still make that claim, which is insane. So, one YouTube series that I absolutely love is called The Movie Rabbit Hole. It's a four-part series on YouTube. If possible, I think we're going to try to link that in the description of these videos.
Yep.
But the subtitle for it is No CGI is really just invisible CGI. The host kind of goes through a lot of very cut and dry examples of people saying there's no VFX in this movie. There's no CGI in this movie. And then very clear examples, visual effects breakdowns that says, oh, look, there's CGI in that movie. There's visual effects in that movie. What they were claiming was the case is a complete and utter lie, and they don't know what they're talking about. Whether that's the director, whether that's producers, whether that's costume designers, set designers, lead actors. Like, think about it this way. When an actor plays in a film, if they are on a set that looks kind of similar to the set that is in the movie, there's no reason for them to believe that CGI was used because they were there. It felt real, but that set that was designed very well might have just been for reference for the CGI that was going to later be used. This happened a lot in the Barbie movie. Barbie claims no CGI. There's no CGI in the Barbie movie, except the entire car chase scene was all CGI for the car. It was all CGI for the environments for the most part. When Barbie's in the real world running from the Mattel board of directors. Also, when they're in Barbie Land, yes, there were some really cool miniatures made. There were some really cool full practical sets that were made. And the artists that worked on that definitely deserve every bit of credit for the amount of work that they did. I think it looked amazing. However, there was a lot of CGI replacements done for those sets, a lot of set extensions done that were fully CGI, fully digitally created elements, or generally digitally created elements where they would take a whole bunch of different plates that were shot on set and then integrate them in kind of a 2.5D system, a CGI space that is just projecting images onto cards at different distances from the camera. That's effectively to fake the idea of parallax as the camera moves through that space. Some of the highlights from that series. People in the VFX industry don't really use the term CGI. I've been using it a lot because I'm talking primarily to people that aren't actually in the VFX industry CGI is something that people in production in the film industry will use all the time. Like if, say, for instance, the Game of Thrones infamous Starbucks cup, that somebody was probably like, hey, can you just CGI that out for me? CGI is not a term that applies to digitally painting out elements because you are always utilizing the footage that was shot on set to paint out that element on set. So that would be visual effects. It's not CGI. And then we'll just add in a CGI creature over here. Well, but are you going to add in a fully CGI creature? Sometimes yes, but more often than not, it's going to involve layers of work that kind of culminates as CGI. So you're going to model that character, you're going to animate that character, you're going to rig that character, you're going to texture that character, you're going to light that character, you're going to composite that character in. There's so many different layers of work that goes into doing what is just simply coined as CGI, which is more 3D animation than anything. In the VFX industry, we just talk about what VFX was done more often than not. Very, very rare that we just talk about something as CGI. In this case, it's just easier to use that nebulous term that's really hard to define how it transitions from VFX to CGI because it is so nebulous. Because we do things projecting footage that was shot on set onto digital cards and then tracking that into a real camera move. So the question is, well, we were using images that were shot on set, but those images that were shot on set are being projected onto CGI cards. So is that CGI or is that VFX? And you get to the point where you're projecting more and more stuff on more and more complicated assets. One thing that's done in the VFX industry is what's called photogrammetry, which now has even taken off beyond that, called Gaussian splatting in NERFs. It's effectively the idea of taking a whole bunch of pictures of a scene or of an object and using that photo information to generate a digital model of it, and then being able to put that digital model into a digital space or taking that digital model and integrating that into a live action space. So that's the thing, like how much of the plate has to be CGI for the shot to be CGI? How much real stuff needs to be put in for it to be considered real? And with photogrammetry, is that considered real stuff or is that considered CGI because it's based on real stuff, but it is a fully digital element. And a lot of 3D animated elements use their textures from photo reference. So again, just layers and layers and layers. I mean, you could argue however you want to argue, and I don't think there's any real benefit to having a hard and fast rule. What is the difference between CGI and VFX? But the general concept is that CGI is primarily and or exclusively digital elements generated in a computer. VFX covers that as well as everything else that's done in post-production to alter the footage or combine the footage with other footage or other things in general after it was shot on set. Another thing he goes through is the levels of CGI, which I just kind of went over to a very quick extent. You have fully CGI, so like nothing was shot on camera. You have computer generated plates with live action elements on it. Once Upon a Time, the ABC show with fairy tales is a good example of that whenever they're in the fantasy world where they are fully real people in a fully digital environment. You also have fully live action plates with computer generated elements. Superhero films are a good example of this. A lot of the time, you'll have Iron Man flying through a city, and that city is real. There was like a drone or there was a helicopter that was shooting the footage up in the sky, and they integrate a fully digital Iron Man flying in. Or sometimes those cities are fully digital, and it's just those shots of like Iron Man walking around where the Iron Man suit is fully digital, the space around him is fully real. You also have split takes. That's where the same or similar camera angles are used, but they want two different performances to be seen in the same frame. So, say for instance, there's a frame where you have one character on the right, one character on the left, and you really like the character on the right's performance from one take, but you like the character on the left's performance from a different take. So, what you can do is just kind of mask out or isolate just the right side for the one you want there, just the left side for the one you want there. And this gets very complicated when it comes to moving cameras. Gets complicated when it comes to different camera angles that are close but not quite, or like it can get to the point where you have a reflection of that character on the right in the left. So you have to make sure the reflection matches correctly. And that reflection might be layering over something. Like it gets really complicated when you're doing split takes very easily, even shadows, things like that. Then there's also live action plates with separately shot live action elements. One really good example of this is Oppenheimer. With Oppenheimer, they did things like working with ferrofluids, working with cloud tanks. If you don't know what ferrofluids are, it's effectively this fluid that has iron shavings or metal shavings in it so that it kind of like spikes in very amorphous and kind of alien ways. These have been used for digital plates to create kind of alien or foreign feeling or even space things in films for many, many years. Cloud tanks is where you basically have like a big tank of water or oil or some kind of liquid, and then you combine some other element into it to create kind of an interesting thing. I mean, the easiest way to think about this is if you ever have a cup of coffee and you pour in your milk gently, if you blow on it before stirring, you'll see the milk swirling around inside of your coffee cup. It's that kind of a thing to a much, much larger scale. And you can come up with some really interesting effects here that can feel otherworldly. They also did small explosions and then literally just scaled them up to feel like much larger explosions. They did smaller explosions that they recorded that they then layered with other explosions. Instead of 10 small explosions, it was one gigantic explosion. There's a lot of different ways to do this. Oppenheimer, I think, did it brilliantly. It's still live action stuff that was shot on live action stuff. Then they also have projected live action plates used as elements. This is what I was talking about with photogrammetry, NERFs, Gaussian splatting, 2.5D projections, that type of thing. Then there's digital or semi-digital actors. You've got like the fully digital character in The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, where like there's no body, there's no head, but it is a fully digital character that looks like a real human inside of a real environment, but it's all digital. Then you have de-aging, like Robert Downey Jr. in Captain America Civil War, where toward the beginning of the movie, he was inside of his own memory and he looked like he was 20 something. That was actually him on set, and there was digital adjustments that were done to make him look younger. Then you have aging. So Peggy Carter in Captain America Winter Soldier, where there was a lot of on-set practical makeup done to make her look a lot older. And then a digital artist came in and added more wrinkles to her face, tracked that in based on the way that she was moving her mouth, the way that her expression shifted. Then you have digital adjustments to characters, which in this instance was primarily kind of a split take, which is making Chris Evans tiny and weak at the beginning of Captain America, the First Avenger, where it was a real actor for the body, not Chris Evans, with Chris Evans' head, which was captured on set. And then they just let Chris Evans have his own body for later on in the film. Then you also have motion capture applied to creature models. Good examples of this is Andy Serkis. He's kind of the primary pioneer of motion capture performances. He's Caesar in Planet of the Apes. He was Gollum in Lord of the Rings. He's been motion capture actor for a lot of things. Benedict Cumberbatch as the dragon from The Hobbit. Zoe Saldana as Neytiri from the Avatar series or Avatar movie, which now has a second movie. So there's a lot of different ways to have digital and or semi-digital actors. Then you can also digitally replace real objects. So for instance, Top Gun Maverick is a good example of what they talked about in that YouTube series where in Top Gun Maverick, they did shoot real actors like Tom Cruise flying real fighter jets. And that happened. They flew real jets. They recorded the footage of real actors flying real jets over real environments. Only thing is, they didn't use 90% of that. They used fully digital environments. They used fully digital jets to replace, and the only part of the frame that you're seeing that's actually real is the actor themselves and the cockpit that's around them. So there is a sense of realism there because you're seeing the G forces shift. The planes are still moving the way that the real planes moved. The environments are still moving the way the real environment moved, but it is fully digital. So whenever people say, "Oh, Top Gun Maverick was amazing because it was all real. They really flew those jets." Yes, they did really fly those jets. No, the jets that you're seeing are not what they actually flew. And then you have to look at all the other movie magic tricks and how that plays into visual effects, like miniature models, forced perspective, live action matte paintings, how what portion of the frame is used for each element, what's considered a hero plate, which is in the visual effects industry, it's what we refer to as the primary plate. The hero plate is like where the main action is happening, the thing that the that one shot is kind of based on. And sometimes it gets very confusing. You can have shots that for part of the shot, it's one plate, and for another part of the shot, it's a completely different plate. If the camera's moving a lot, or if something enters the frame or exits the frame that might have been blocking space. So it can get very complicated very quickly. So having hard and fast rules for what defines what is not always beneficial because it's a very amorphous process. It's kind of, in ways, whatever works, works. So let's see, some other things he went through in that YouTube series. Real is fake, and it's been fake since the beginning of filmmaking. You look at the set extensions that were done in the Star Wars original trilogy. You look at the set extensions that were done back in the 40s and 50s. I mean, set extensions have been a thing since the very beginning of filmmaking. Not digital visual effects, but visual effects as movie magic has been done pretty much since the advent of filmmaking. There was not a very long amount of time before production companies realized it's a lot cheaper to have somebody paint a painting where that is what's most of what's seen on set. And then that's going to be painted on a piece of glass. The camera then looks through that glass, and then there's a small little window where the actual action is happening. That's where the real stuff happens. If you want to get down to like what was actually on set and done a certain way. Even then, I mean, most of the sets you look at are not real because it's not like it's actually inside of a house. It's on a soundstage, which means everything through that doorway is just an empty like warehouse. It's not the rest of the house like it seems like it is. So movie magic has made it so that you can create these films without doing the amount of work to really do what it's perceived as happening in the film. Also looking at models and practical elements that they're not inherently better than digital elements and vice versa. Doing something digitally without having something practical on set means that you don't have reference for it. So it's always a good idea to have something practical on set to reference whenever you're creating a digital element. Like in Top Gun Maverick, those planes, the way they move is very crucial. The actor's performance in the cockpit, making sure that they are tilting and leaning the correct way that matches the plane's movement. So having a real plane there definitely made the digital planes look much more real once they were replaced. But also vice versa, practical elements don't necessarily look a lot better than digital elements. There's a lot of examples of this where it just looks cheap or the physics are wrong. Look at Lord of the Rings 2 with the floods that happen around Isengard. Like it's so obviously a model that everything's fallen apart. And then you can look at The Hobbit, for instance, the first Hobbit movie where they're in the cave with trolls and everything's crashing down. You know what? Everything moves in a slightly not real way, but it's filmed in a way so that it feels more real than you could probably do with a practical element. You have a lot more leeway to adjust things after the fact and make sure that you're getting the shot that you're actually looking for. But Lord of the Rings 1 and 3 are really good examples of combining those two, where sometimes it is models, sometimes it is digital extensions on real models with practical sets being used for the rest of the plate. Like it gets very complicated the way you can layer everything together. But there's no inherently better way to do it. It just depends on what works for that shot and for that film. There's also a lot of misunderstandings about when CGI is used in a film, even by the people who worked high up on the film. As I was saying before, directors, producers, actors, they might have a plan for doing everything practically, and then by the end of the movie realize, we that doesn't really work. Like we do need to do some visual effects and some CGI to modify what was shot on set, whether that's split takes or whatever, or digital replacements of elements. And people will use interviews from before the film released to say, hey, there's no CGI in that film, but the director had to change their plan. They had to pivot because things didn't work out the way that they were hoping it would. There was CGI in the film, even though you have evidence of the director saying there's not. There's also, as I said, actors that are on a set. They think everything's real, but they're not part of the post-production process. When they're done filming, they go home and they start working on another movie until they have to come back for marketing for the movie that they shot. But there's editing that's done. There's all the post-production work that's done can modify what they think was shot and what was actually shot and what was modified on set. Same with set designers, same with costume designers. Like they may think, or makeup artists, another good example, like looking at Stranger Things and the way that Vecna was quote unquote fully real. Like look at these like extensive hours long processes of getting Vecna into his outfit, into his makeup, to really sell these vines and the upside down and like making it look super real. There's a reason why it looks real. It's because it is real. And then you look at visual effects breakdowns of Vecna and you find out that there's a bunch of shots where he is 100% CGI. There are other shots where the only thing real about him is his head. And there's other shots where his body is real, but there's so much CGI around him that he might as well not be. But that actor sat in a chair for hours and hours and hours to get into that look. So, as far as the actor knows, as far as the makeup artist knows, everything that you see in there is real because they're not visual effects artists. They don't know about the post-production process. So, something to keep in mind when you're hearing people say, oh, there's no CGI in that movie. Even if they worked on it, that doesn't mean there's no CGI in that movie. I would suggest looking up CGI breakdowns, VFX breakdowns from the different studios that actually worked on those films because generally speaking, you will see those VFX studios credited at the end of the film, even when they say there's no CGI used. And then you have studios that have been so wholeheartedly pushing this idea that they don't use CGI, they don't use VFX, that they will use CGI and VFX on their behind the scenes footage. The most recent Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise did this. They digitally replaced the footage that you see being recorded on their camera to use the final version of what was seen in the film instead of using what was actually seen on that camera at that time. They will do color corrections to remove green screen plates to make it seem like they were working on a gray screen or a blue screen that's not a green screen, so it doesn't look like it's CGI. It doesn't look like it's VFX. I think one of the best examples of this was, well, something similar to this was the Barbie movie. There was an article that highlighted that there was no CGI in the Barbie movie. The still image that they used as an example of how they did things like they did back in the 50s was Ken and Barbie in the car with a blue screen behind them that had to be digitally replaced. Keying out, which is isolating an area using color information or brightness information, keying out that blue screen is a digital process. So there was VFX in the Barbie movie. It was not the way that they used to do it because keying, the way it used to be done, is completely different because it was an actual physical process. It's not physical anymore, it's all digital. It is extremely rare for directors to shoot in physical film. It's almost all digital recording that's happening. So yes, lot of that.
Touching back on invisible effects to talk about how integral and how much it's been part of the industry since the very beginning. We all remember those black and white Charlie Chaplin movies, right? And even in then, there was invisible VFX. There were things called matte paintings or set extensions, as we mainly call them today, where you would create something in the environment that wasn't there. You would just look at the perspective based on the direction the camera's facing, and you would create an entire background to match that perspective so it looks like it's part of the scene. In Charlie Chaplin films, you had these huge, see-through glass window panes that they would paint on. So you have lifelike matte paintings, and they would just line it up right in front of the camera, and Charlie Chaplin would be right in the center of the screen and he would act as if he would be in the jungle or he would be close to the edge of a cliff. And all of this would be created and shot in frame, in camera, as we would call it, because everything was done right there on set. And they would create these illusions right in front of you. And so those are the type of invisible visual effects that existed from way back in the beginning of filmmaking that have always been there. So that's a little aside. And there's other visible effects like you didn't mention, like anytime there's a screen in a scene, if it's a TV, if there's someone's looking at their phone on the laptop, anytime you see a screen, it's always blank. Maybe it may be on, but it's just a blank screen. And we go in there and digitally add in whatever graphics, video they're watching or whatever news program is on. So there's a lot of stuff that's done that you don't even think about, that people take for granted that those are all visual effects. And these are things that get downplayed all the time, but these are things that we're always doing constantly. We're going to leave it there for this week. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Be sure to catch the next one.